Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Very cold morning in Berlin, -10 degrees, but sunny, unusually. Welcome to DGAP morning briefing on geopolitical challenges. I'm Milan, a senior fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations. And today it's my pleasure and honor to step in for my colleague Henning Wolff to moderate this morning briefing, which is our last before Christmas break. We will once again focus on Russia's war against Ukraine, which is not showing any sign of winter pause. We will hear more from András about intensive fighting around the town of Bakhmut, about Ukraine's new ability to strike airfields hundreds of kilometers deep inside Russia, as well as about Russia's effort to weaponize winter and break the Ukraine's resistance and morale by systematic missile attacks on energy hubs, heating systems, and other critical infrastructure across Ukraine. Last weekend, for instance, 1.5 million people just in Odessa were without electricity with below zero temperatures. In Brussels, meanwhile, European Union foreign ministers on Monday discussed how to further assist Ukraine in repairing its energy system and providing emergency electricity exports. They could not finalize the 9th package of sanctions against Russia. It remains work in progress. More on that perhaps in our briefing. EU ambassadors were working overnight on Monday to reach an agreement on emergency financial aid of 18 billion euros for next year for Ukraine through the so-called joint EU borrowing. Again, we will discuss what does it mean and why it's important, whether this is enough for Ukraine for next year in our briefing. But the interesting bit there was that Hungary eventually lifted its veto as part of a bigger package deal that included a slightly lower level of suspended funds from regular EU budget for Hungary under the new rule of law conditionality and approval of Hungary's recovery fund plan at the council level. However, individual payments to Budapest will still be linked to tangible improvements in anti-corruption measures. And because this is the end of the year European Council summit, there are last-minute surprises. One of them happened last night. As Sherpas were preparing the European Council agenda, Poland announced that it has problems with this package, concretely with a small bit European Union ratification of the global minimum tax rate, and it is still blocking everything, and it will bring it to the leaders level to resolve. Meanwhile, this week, the European Parliament was shaken by its worst ever alleged bribery scandal involving Qatar, Morocco, one of the vice president of the European Parliament, and more people. Again, we will hear more about it, but it's been a heavy agenda on the EU level this week. We will also discuss broader political implications for Europe for next year. So to discuss this and more, we have 3 excellent speakers today. In order of appearance, I have the great pleasure of welcoming first my colleague, Dr. András Rácz. Hello, András. Hello to Budapest.
Good morning.
András is a senior fellow at the International Order and Democracy Program here at DGAP. Then I hope Caroline de Gruyter, veteran Europe correspondent and columnist for Dutch newspaper Handelsblad, is with us. She had some connecting problems. If not, she will appear later. Yes, there you are.
Good morning, Milan. I'm there.
And great. I'm glad it worked. And last but certainly not least, DGAP Director, Dr. Guntram Wolff.
Good morning.
Good morning. Each speaker has about 5 to 6 minutes for their remarks. We will be opening up for your questions and comments for after roughly 30 minutes. Please note that this event is recorded and we will have to close at around 9:30. At this point, I would like to thank my colleagues, Henning Hoff and Julia Loeva, for their support in organizing these DGAP morning briefings. And now, to start us off, András, let's hear from you about the war.
Thank you, Milan. Good morning to all of you. Thank you for joining us, even now so late and relatively close to the incoming winter holidays. So without any further ado, please allow me to share my screen and show you the usual maps prepared by the Institute for the Study of War in order to map out the actual military situation. First, as usual, we start with the larger scale strategic map. Most of the fighting, the most intensive fighting has been taking place at present and in the Donbas direction, in the Donbas front line. Here, Russian forces have continued launching frontal attacks against the Ukrainian positions in Avdiivka, Bakhmut, and a number of other places. Here, this kind of fighting in the Donbas, more and more people compare it to the front lines of the First World War against at Verdun. So real, proper trench warfare with extremely heavy losses on both sides. Even though Russians have gained some marginal territories, it's quite unlikely that they would achieve any kind of breakthrough in the upcoming weeks and months due to very simple strategic operational reason. I mean, if you remember the beginning of the war, the Russian strategic plan was actually to encircle the Ukrainian troops defending the Donbas. One line of the encirclement was supposed to come from the Kharkiv region, so from the north. Another was supposed to come from the Zaporizhia region, so from the south. Meanwhile, attacks across the Donbas front line were intended only to keep the Ukrainian units in place. However, now with Russia lost control over Ukraine's Kharkiv region thanks to Ukraine's liberation operations, no strategic encirclement is possible anymore. So the originally supplementary attack conducted across the Donbas front line has now become the Russian main effort. Here, on this map, you show it better, you see it better what a strategic encirclement would have meant, but this is not possible anymore. So instead of any kind of larger maneuvering operation, Russia is launching really frontal attacks against the Donbas front line. This is a higher resolution map. Most of the fighting, or the most intensive fighting, is taking place right now around Bakhmut. Russian troops already entered the city, or actually what's left of the city. However, even if Russians take Bakhmut, this wouldn't change much in the military stance. The Russian domestic propaganda will surely be able to create a big political victory out of it, but militarily, this would result in no breakthrough. This whole region has been extremely fortified by Ukraine in the last 8 years. So Ukraine has been preparing this region for Russian attack already for 8 years. So even if Ukraine loses 1 or 2 fortified positions, there are plenty more fortified positions in the hinterland. And Bakhmut, for which Russian troops have been fighting for 4 months, Bakhmut is a relatively small city. I mean, before the war, it had a population of like 40,000. There are other bigger cities further back in the Ukrainian territories, even more fortified than Bakhmut. So even if Ukraine loses control over the ruins of the city, this wouldn't change much in the military realities. When it comes to the upcoming future in the winter, one shall not expect any kind of operational pause or any kind of decrease in the operational speed concerning particularly the Ukrainian side, but also the Russian side. The last 2 months in the front line have been dominated by the autumn weather, heavy rains, deep mud. I mean, most of the lands simply turned into kind of a muddy soup, which made it impossible for mechanized troops to move around. However, when the real winter sets in and the ground freezes, Ukraine is surely going to launch 1 or 2 major counterattacks, and in order to liberate more territories. And Russian forces will also try to use the huge number of mobilized soldiers deployed to the front line in order most probably to gain further territories in the Donbas. So heavy fightings are to come in the upcoming month, despite the winter weather. Meanwhile, while these things are happening in the front line, there are deep strikes on both sides. As Milan mentioned, Ukraine recently managed to strike 2 Russian military airports several hundreds of kilometers behind the front line. While initially many people hoped that these strikes against these airports signified the appearance of a new Ukrainian capability, a new Ukrainian long-range strike capability. Now it looks like that Ukraine modified 2 old Soviet reconnaissance drones, the Tupolev 141s, and with these 2 old converted drones, they managed to hit these airports. But unfortunately, from Ukraine's perspective, there seems to be not too many more of these old systems. So yet it was quite too early to celebrate the emergence of Ukraine's new strike capability. Looks like that these deep strikes were kind of one-off. Meanwhile, Russia is continuing to destroy Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Based on Ukrainian official information, more than 50% of Ukraine's energy grid have already been destroyed. Of course, this is always a moving target because one variable is the number of Russian attacks. The other variable is Ukraine's repairing efforts. The third variable is basically the weather conditions. However, here I would like to point out a false dilemma, which has been present in many Western analyses. People often speculate whether Russia will be able to break Ukraine's population simply because of destroying the critical infrastructure. But in reality, the Ukrainian population has more than 2 choices. So the choice is not only freeze to death or force Zelensky to start negotiating. There is also a third option, namely to leave. So to escape from the winter weather, to find shelter somewhere else, outside of the bigger cities or in Ukraine's EU neighbors, and this pattern is already visible. So the number of Ukrainians crossing the borders is already growing. When the real winter sets in, this is likely to continue and also increase in terms of numbers. Last thing from my side, bad news. Recently emerged report from the think tank Conflicts Armament Research indicates that based on the wreckages of Russian cruise missiles shot down over Kiev, based on the analysis of the wreckages, it looks like that Russia is still able to produce at least some types of cruise missiles. More particularly, the H-101 is still in the production line. So it seems to be that Western sanctions and the technological isolation of Russia did not fully stop Moscow's ability to produce at least some cruise missiles. Numbers, we don't know. We don't know whether this is true also for the other cruise missile types, but still the original hopes many of us had that sanctions will deprive Russia of the ability to produce modern cruise missiles. This is not fully true. So this is where we are at the moment. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer. Over, Milan, back to you.
Thank you, András, and we will come back to it in Q&A later. Over to you, Caroline. What a week it has been on the EU level, and it's not over yet. The European Council Summit will start in a few hours. So let's hear your initial remarks.
Yes. Good morning. Sorry, I'm joining via my phone. I just got a new computer and I couldn't figure out how to get the audio work. But I hope you hear me well.
Yes, we do. Yeah, and thank you for joining us this morning.
Okay, good. So yes, let's start with Qatar Gate. But there's not a lot we can say about Qatar Gate because nobody knows what it means. One of the vice presidents of the European Parliament, a Greek social democrat, has been arrested and apparently in flagrante delicto, so with a big bag of money, and a couple of former MEPs and parliamentary assistants have also been arrested. In total, they found $1.5 million so far, which is a lot of money. But many people are now focusing on how corrupt the parliament is and so on. And I would be a little bit cautious about this. Yes, it is. I think it is very bad. But I was listening to the French radio yesterday. They had a program about this, and within 2 minutes, the story was about how the Qataris were buying French politicians and business people left and right. Former President Sarkozy was apparently rather spoiled by Qatar, and there, somebody was also saying that President Macron had gotten such lavish presents from Qatar that he reportedly sent them back to Doha via the French embassy there. So good he did that, of course. But it tells you also that, yes, there is a big problem here in Brussels, and I hope they manage to stamp all this out and take prevention measures. But it also indicates that the problem is a little bit wider than just Brussels. And for the rest, I'm afraid we will have to wait and see how big this is. Let's hope it stops here. So yes, well, Milan, you mentioned already there is a bit more substantial news in Brussels. Many deals are coming to a close because it's the end of the year and everybody wants to get it done and over with. It was a turbulent year, I think. So there are a lot of dossiers that need to be finalized, and of course, Brussels is not Brussels if member states are not trying to link those dossiers. So today there will be a European summit, meaning heads of state and government, all 27 will come to Brussels today to finalize, to tie the last knots, or however you phrase it. But the one deal you mentioned has been finalized by ambassadors this week already, sparing, so it seems, heads of state and government, a nasty spat mainly with Hungary, because a big knot of, you could call it a Gordian knot almost, was cut on Monday evening. Hungary was the last member state blocking a formidable aid package of 18 billion euros for 2023 for Ukraine. And Hungary was blocking it. And it was also blocking a corporate tax, a minimum corporate tax agreement that in essence had been agreed by everybody, but Hungary refused to sign off. And on Monday evening, suddenly Hungary lifted those two blockages, and in exchange it got 55% of subsidy of the subsidies, regular subsidies, funding from the European budget. The rest, the 45%, it won't get. It remains blocked because of Hungary's worsening record with transparency and accountability with EU money, our taxpayers' money, basically. So. And then there was a fourth piece of this puzzle, which is Hungary's COVID recovery plan. And member states have just approved it. So Hungary's programs. But, and they had to do it because otherwise the whole plan would have expired by January 1st. But Hungary will not get the money, around 7-8 billion, because that will only be disbursed if Hungary improves its democratic record, which it seems is not going to be anytime soon. So that's looked solved, and now Poland is at it. Indeed, yesterday evening, suddenly, when everybody was relieved, like there will be no big spat, because that's, what it would have come down to with Prime Minister Orban at the summit today. Now, Poland is suddenly blocking this minimum corporate tax because it wants its share of the COVID recovery fund. 35 billion euros. It's not nothing. And which, as you know, has been held up for rule of law reasons. I guess they will find some kind of a solution today, but it will probably not be a beautiful one. And needless to say, everybody is not really amused by this. I think there are two interesting things, takeaways. First, these vetoes. If you step back a little bit, I think we will see more and more of this. Since Putin's invasion in Ukraine, member states have asked for much more Europe. So there is much more Europe in the security field, energy, a lot of issues. Member states are asking for new European policies all the time. But so there's more Europe, but it's increasingly an intergovernmental Europe. This means that the member states, these are sensitive issues. These member states want to keep their hands on the wheel themselves. They don't want to hand over too much responsibility to the European Commission, but they want to stay involved, and they want to keep responsibility for themselves. So the EU is starting to look more and more, in my view, like a bazaar, with haggling, with tantrums, with walkouts, and so on. And some even call it a kids' playground. It's always been like this, but it gets worse. And I think we better get used to it. Second observation, if I may, back on Hungary, you can criticize the European Union for still disbursing funds to Budapest at all. But don't forget, this is the first time member states gave one of their peers, you know, they hate to do these things, such a slap in the face over democracy and values. And I think it is a milestone. It's not perfect. Nothing is ever perfect in the European Union. What I think Hungary is going to do, what I hear here in Brussels, is that Hungary is going to set up two parallel economies in the future. One for European money, you know, sort of cleanish, with a strong overview and supervision, and another more corrupt and politicized for the national economy. I think this story is not over. And to close, a brief remark, if I may, about the mood in Brussels concerning EU unity vis-à-vis Ukraine. I think leaders are remaining firmly behind Kiev, except Hungary, and to a certain extent also Austria. But I think all governments are becoming very much afraid of the anger of their citizens over rising energy costs, over soaring food prices, and so on. We just got our energy bill as well, and I bought myself special gloves without fingers because, you know, it's a lot of money. So voters in some countries are starting to ask why we need sanctions against Russia if they hurt us too. And I think for this reason, governments are spending money like water at the moment. We will see some interesting discussions on deficits and debts. But they want to do this because we need to keep up support for Ukraine. Actually, I don't think this really has a big effect on EU policy on Ukraine yet. Member states are drafting the 9th sanctions package against Russia. It isn't agreed yet. Negotiations about the gas price cap are ongoing today as well, with member states divided. But look at a tracker of Kiel University, which shows that as of, I think, last week, the EU has overtaken the US as the biggest donor to Ukraine. There was a big donor conference in Paris with 46 countries as well, a massive show of force. Militarily speaking, a lot is happening too. And Russia, Ukraine, if Poland allows them, will be at the top of the agenda of the European Council in Brussels today. So I don't think we're doing too badly, and let me leave it here.
Thank you so much. It was fascinating, very comprehensive overview. I let you go beyond the allocated time, but thanks so much for painting this picture. And I think it was also a nice transition at the end for Guntram.
Yes, thank you so much. And I think Caroline already made some points I also wanted to make. But starting from the energy situation, let me just mention that we've just published a piece on the energy situation in Germany and Central and Eastern Europe. It's on the DGAP website. There's also a short op-ed summarizing some key results in Die Welt available as of today. And so on the energy situation, I think the key is that energy savings have been very substantial in Germany. So 20 to 30% energy savings, both, gas savings, both in the household sector as well as in the industry sector. Of course, now the temperature outside here in Berlin is -9 degrees Celsius. So this week, I'm sure our energy bill will go up quite a bit. But the key point is that adjusting for temperature, really the consumption has been down a lot. But if the winter is a very, very cold winter, and lasts, these temperatures last throughout the winter, then, storages will be quite depleted by the end of the winter, and then the energy problem will really come to bite us next year. So this winter, basically most simulations suggest that the storages will not be depleted, unless we have really sort of a dramatically cold winter, which is very unlikely. But the problem is, the more we deplete the storages now, the more difficult it will be to refill them next year. So that's on the energy situation. On the support for Ukraine, I basically share Caroline's view. I think there is an EU relatively broad consensus to support Ukraine, with perhaps the exception of, I'm less sure about the Austrian exception that you mentioned. In Austria, the debate is, I would say, quite divided, but certainly Hungary is not supporting Kiev, but the others are. And the real question, and if you take the Kiel tracker, the EU has moved ahead of the United States. And also if you take the discussion on military equipment, actually it is accelerating from the EU side, and Germany, for example, that has been really heavily criticized for being late in delivering weapons, including by myself, has now really caught up. It's still not top, but it's better than it was a few months ago. So there is some improvement. Now, I wanted to talk a bit about the financial side of it. And Caroline, you mentioned already the 18 billion package, but let's start from sort of the economic analysis of where Ukraine stands at this point. So GDP has contracted by between 30 to 40% this year. That's huge, 30 to 40%, that's dramatic. Based on that contraction, the Ukrainian finance ministry estimated that for next year, there will be a slight improvement of 2 or 3%. So a slight recovery. And that was the estimate from early October, which the finance minister presented at the big conference, donor conference here in Berlin. I was on a panel with the Ukrainian finance minister discussing that. And, you know, basically based on that sort of assumption about GDP slightly recovering, but basically stabilizing at this stage, the finance ministry and the European institutions come to a budget deficit of 38 billion euros or dollars for next year. So that's the gap in the budget, 38 billion. Now, the first point here to note is that gap could be bigger, right? I mean, what Russia is now doing is it's systematically destroying the energy infrastructure. And if there's no electricity, I mean, basically your productivity goes down even further. So my guess would be the budget deficit next year is going to be bigger than the 38 billion. Now, what can be done about such a big budget deficit? Well, you can't really raise taxes, right? I mean, if your economic activity collapses, you can't fill it with additional taxes. You can't really cut other spending, and the Ukrainian finance ministry showed how civilian spending, for example, social security or pensions, have been cut quite substantially in real terms. So there's not much you can do there. You can do two things. If you want to cut spending, you can cut rebuilding efforts. So basically, don't fix bridges that have been bombed and don't fix the electricity system. The problem is that's you know, making the situation even worse because it dampens your economic activity. So you really have to keep that up, right? I mean, you have to rebuild the essential infrastructure. And well, the last point is military spending, and military spending has increased dramatically in billions of dollars or billions of Ukrainian currency. It's more than doubled since March, you know, that's the only budget item, so to speak, where the Ukrainian government could cut, right? Now, if they cut in that category, it will have direct military consequences, right? So basically, what I'm saying, success of Ukraine crucially depends on the financial support that Ukraine will get next year from the outside, from the West, and that's why this package of 18 billion is so important, and we can talk about that package in some detail. What I think is important here is that cash starts flowing as soon as possible. I mean, it's not an optimal design of a package. I mean, it's credit based. There's all kinds of discussion around conditionality and all of that. I think all of these things really are secondary. What is now important is that there's actual real cash flowing to Ukraine from the West and from the EU, so as to fund the budget deficit and thereby allow Ukraine to continue funding the war effort. This is, I think, the first obligation from the macro-financial side, because without the money, I mean, wars cost money. Without the money, the military situation will deteriorate for Ukraine for sure. So that's why this package is really important. Is it enough? I don't think the 18 billion will be enough. The budget deficit, as I pointed out, is bigger. Now there's other institutions chipping in money. There's also the US. But it looks, I mean, let's say if you think the deficit is 40 billion, the EU will have to chip in more. I mean, so this is not going to be enough for next year. I think there will be more aid packages coming in the spring because otherwise the military situation will deteriorate. And perhaps I stop here.
Thank you. We are slightly over time, but still, Guntram, if you want to take one more minute to comment the fact that for the first time this EU package was put together through something called joint borrowing at the financial markets. It was also hailed as a breakthrough. Why and what does it mean?
Yeah, I mean, this point on the joint borrowing, I mean, that's a sort of the EU kitchen, right? I mean, so we don't really have a lot of joint borrowing. The EU has started to do this at a larger scale with the COVID recovery fund, which, by the way, has also passed now the hurdle of the German Constitutional Court. There were some qualifications to it, but it has basically passed the court, and so there is now this instrument of borrowing against the EU budget, and the European budget next year has some headroom because of inflation, so that basically increases the headroom on the revenue side and on the guarantee side, and while spending doesn't automatically increase with inflation. And so that headroom can be used, and against that headroom, basically against that guarantee, additional borrowing can be done. And so in that sense, it's a joint EU response. And I really hope that today's European Council will seal that deal firmly, because I mean that's a big step and an important step.
Very good. With this, let me open up formally or rather move us to the questions and answer part. Please raise your hand. I prefer to take questions via video function through raise your hand. Introduce yourself and put question directly to the panel. Alternatively, you can submit your questions to via chat. There are already two of them. I'll come back to them later, but I see one hand raised by Rainer Rudolph. So let's go to Vienna.
Hi, thanks, Milan. I'm Rainer Rudolph. I work at the German Embassy in Vienna. I just wanted to make one quick comment rather than a question on the question of Austria and Hungary and their position on sanctions. So in my view, 2 points. One is, yes, obviously they have a long history of close business and political connections to Russia. And yes, it's also true there was a discussion in the center-right party, the ÖVP, which is in government over the summer, on this question. But it was put down after a couple of weeks. I think more importantly, there is actual policy change here. They are reducing their gas imports substantially. They published a figure a couple of weeks ago that the share of gas imports from Russia has gone from 80 to 21% since the beginning of the year. Obviously, there is no large-scale Russian investment of the type that's going on in Hungary with a nuclear power plant there. So I think it's fair to say that awareness is really growing here that there will not be a return to the pre-February 24 situation anytime in the foreseeable future. Thanks.
Good. Thank you, Rainer. Any response to this from our speakers?
I can comment on that. I was in Austria all of last week, and asking many people about this issue, because in Brussels the perception is often that Austria, of course, it goes along with EU sanctions, but among member states, Austria is very skeptical about this in general. So they usually follow the line. They never block anything. That's not how Austria operates. But I think the concerns about these sanctions are still pretty large among Austrian policymakers and also companies. And that's also the answers that they gave me there. But they're not as obstructive as the Hungarians are by far. So it's a different story. That's absolutely true.
András, do you want to chip in here and maybe share with us how the Hungarian government responded to that deal on Monday night? We predicted in our joint analysis 1 week ago that Viktor Orbán, the Prime Minister, will not drag these things up to the European Council level because it would not be very comfortable. He was quite isolated. But did they, Caroline described at the beginning that this is a milestone, that a member state that was using the EU money to build up their patronage system while also backsliding on democracy and rule of law was shown the limits. But I noticed that they also, of course, they found a way how to pep this up as a victory.
Of course, and I fully agree with Caroline. This is the first ever case probably when a member state was using the threat of veto, and this threat of veto was basically taken out of the hand of the given member state. With other words, this is the first case when the EU managed to efficiently circumvent the veto threat without giving in, without giving any large-scale concession. And I think the Czech EU presidency played a crucial role in that. So when the Hungarians came up with the veto threat on Tuesday or Monday night, and by Saturday, the EU alternative of 26 member states circumventing the Hungarians, this alternative was already ready. So from the perspective of kind of political management, this was a huge success for the Czech EU presidency. And when it comes to how it was presented in the Hungarian domestic political context, of course, it was celebrated as a large strategic victory. I mean, this is what one has the government media for, right? So always to celebrate being victorious. The interesting thing that is missing from the Hungarian domestic discussion is, Milan, what you pointed out in the very beginning, that any disbursement from this money is still conditioned to the fulfillment of the rule of law criteria. Exactly. So even if Hungary claims to have achieved some kind of a big victory, in the very end, they are not going to get even a single cent out of it, out of the suspended funds. And why is it important? Right now in Hungary, social tensions are rising, and teachers and students are demonstrating already for months because of the really bad conditions in the education system. And the government has presented kind of a solution that if the EU approves Hungary's RRF plan, so recovery and reconstruction plan, then teachers' salaries could be raised from this money. And how the government communicates is now, if the EU starts disbursing the funds, finally we could raise the teacher's salary. So the Orbán system domestically keeps putting the blame on the EU, even for absolutely domestic problems like situation of the education system. So I maintain what we wrote in our analytical paper, linked up there also in the chat section. More and more conflicts are to come. A more tense relation between Hungary and Brussels is to come, unfortunately. But still, this deal brokered by the Czech presidency, which finally defused or disarmed the Hungarian veto, it was a big success for the EU.
I mean, can I add on this?
Please come. Yes.
No, I mean, I just want to reinforce that point. I mean, it's really a really big change in the way EU funding operates, right? I mean, we used to basically have EU funding with both eyes closed to what is happening with the money in the country. And it's very well known that there's a lack of transparency on EU funding, both structural funds as well as the common agricultural funds. So the two biggest items of the EU budget, making up almost 2/3 of the budget, are dispersed with relatively little transparency and with significant risks to basically misuse of those funds. And there have been lots of reports. Investigative journalists, for example, from the New York Times, have had a very, very good report, I think a year or two ago, in which they describe how structural funds were misused in Hungary to a significant extent. And now what we really have is we have the first time really created a system where rule of law considerations and assessments of fraud and corruption can directly impact financial payouts. You know, the fact that there's a decision how to basically not do it, not disperse, I think the number was 6.3 billion. I mean, that's huge. I mean, it's for a country like Hungary, it's a lot of money. And I think it shows that the EU has responded to you know, a dramatic situation where funds were really, really misused. And so in that sense, I think it's really a big step forward. It's not perfect, as Caroline says. Nothing is perfect in the EU. But I mean, compared to where we came from, where the EU came from, it's a huge step.
Yes, absolutely. And also, it was notable what Caroline described at the end, that in the Orban system, we might see in Hungary development of two parallel economies. And just to make one point, the other one, which will not be tied to more transparency and more monitoring by the EU, could be also sustained by Chinese loans. There is now a lot of talk about loans that Budapest is taking from China. But this is not a morning briefing on Hungary, although with András we would be ready to focus on that in the next year. So I see another raised hand from Eileen. Good morning.
Good morning. I hope I'm audible despite my stuffy nose. I have a question for András. You mentioned that it seems that Russia is able to maintain some of its lines of productions of cruise missiles. Could you comment on whether Iranian or North Korean weapons have appeared on the battlefield on Russia's side? And if so, is that really the sort of that decisive as it has been discussed even in this morning briefing a couple of weeks ago, but also in other fora? Thank you.
Eileen, also for this question which allows us to get back to the ongoing war. For a few minutes.
Okay, thank you, Eileen. Regarding Iranian drones, so Iran and North Korea are supplying more things than just one particular weapon system. Iran is supplying 3 different types of drones. All are relatively simple, primitive machines, but there are a lot of them. In the last few weeks, Russia was evidently short of these drones. Probably the supplies have run out, but since the beginning of this week, drone strikes started again. So it looks like that Iran shipped a new amount of these drones. These drones are not strategic game changers, particularly because as Ukraine's air defense system is becoming more and more efficient, in which actually German aid plays a key role. Both the IRIS-T air defense missiles and particularly the Gepard self-propelled anti-aircraft guns. So the drone threat can be countered better and better. The problem might come if Iran really starts shipping ballistic missiles to Ukraine. Because against ballistic missiles, Ukraine's air defense is basically, stands basically no chance. Ballistic missiles fly on a different trajectory and with a much higher speed than drones do. So far, there has been no documented cases of Iranian air defense missiles being present in the front line. But I'm still afraid that this might come soon. Iran, in addition to these weapon systems, Iran is providing the Russian troops with huge numbers of protective equipment, helmets, bulletproof vests, knee protectors, a lot of other things. So Iran is supplying Russia with a huge amount of military gear. When it comes to North Korea, North Koreans are sending artillery ammunition, millions of it. And Russia also contracted North Korean companies to produce winter uniforms for the Russian forces, because the Russian army is short of winter uniforms for the mobilized soldiers. So those very lucky mobilized soldiers will have the chance to go to war in North Korean uniforms. And Russia is trying also to increase the number and scope of things it imports from North Korea. To cut a long story short, none of these elements, or equipment, or weapon systems are high-tech. These are low-tech systems, but these are available in very huge numbers. So these imports from Iran, from North Korea, will help Russia keep running its war machine despite the domestic production shortages. So basically, this is the story. Both supply line will not only remain active, but Russia will increase the supply lines, the import, both from Iran and also from North Korea. The big story to watch is the Iranian ballistic missiles.
The question in the chat from Rebecca Harms, if it's true that Austrian company is contributing to production of drones for Russia, please keep it short.
Sorry, just reply. I haven't yet seen that report. Need to check it. The important thing is to define whether we speak about active shipments of components even after the sanctions were adopted, or whether we speak about something that Russia stockpiled components yet before the adoption of the sanctions. So details really matter here. So if, let's say, a drone is shot down with an Austrian component inside it, it really matters when that given component was produced and shipped to Russia. So details matter here. I need to go for the details. I haven't yet seen this particular report. Thank you.
Eileen, I see your hands raised again. Do you want to come in?
I just, if I may have a follow-on question to what András just elaborated on. You mentioned that the real danger comes from the prospect of Iran providing Russia with cruise missiles. First of, do you have any sense of, ballistic missiles, excuse me. First of, how likely do you think this is going to be? And also, what kind of systems are then needed on Ukraine's part to counter those missiles? And thirdly, do you see the West being ready to deliver those systems?
These are complicated questions.
It's very important questions, but András, please keep it short so we can move on to other topics. And let me add in the information from Washington that Pentagon is considering supply of Patriot air defense system.
Yes, so chances of Iran delivering the missiles very high. What do we need to do? Supply the Ukrainians with the ballistic missile defense systems, Patriots, more IRIS-Ts, all these. Increase the help provided for Ukraine to restore the damage done to the energy infrastructure. Because this is a huge country. 2 more Patriot systems won't change the course of the war. So we need to help the Ukrainians in repairing the damage. And fourth, provide them, if possible, with intelligence information on the stationing of these missiles on Russian soil, so to enable Ukraine to strike the missile bases once missiles start getting delivered.
Carolina, do you want to come in on these issues discussed, or we can move on?
I don't know a lot about weapon deliveries, so let's keep ourselves in the hands of András. That's safer.
Boris, do you have questions on the war?
Yes, one question on the war and one question about weapons for Dr. Rácz, if it's possible.
So shoot, as they say.
Okay. Dr. Rácz, 2 questions. First of all, Slovakia has announced to be the first country that will deliver MiG-29 jets to Ukraine. Will it have any impact on the course of the war? And the second question, Belarus has allowed to use its territory for the transport of Ukrainian grain. How do you assess this move by Belarus? Thank you.
Thank you. When it comes to Slovak MiG-29s, well, this is not the first case Ukraine is receiving MiG-29s. Ukraine received a lot of MiG-29s even before the Slovak delivery. Only those MiG-29s were not assembled. So there was a way to actually circumvent many regulations. Still, if Slovakia supplies the MiGs, it will help the Ukrainian Air Force remain operational, not only in terms of the number of jets, but also in terms of spare parts. So yes, an important move. When it comes to the Belarus deal, so Belarus allowing the shipment of Ukrainian grain across Belarusian territory, I need to look for the details. When I saw the news, I was quite puzzled. Looks like a bit that Lukashenko is trying to keep at least some options open also in a positive track vis-a-vis Kiev. But I think, unfortunately, it's much more important that Belarus is allowing Russian troops and forces to use Belarusian territory and military infrastructure more and more. So if Russia decides to attack or continue attacking Ukraine from Belarusian territory, a small grain deal is not going to help.
Move on to other topics in on our discussion today. I want to move on and to look at the implications for next year. This is the year of German presidency of the G7. G7 was instrumental in coordinating all sanctions and response, Western response to the war. Guntram, what's your assessment of Germany's role there? And when you look at Chancellor Scholz and his sort of facilitation or his role on the EU level, which will be tested again at this summit, in keeping EU unity together on Ukraine, you were critical in your public statements previously. What's your assessment at the end of the year?
No, well, I mean that's now a big question in the last 4 minutes that you're putting on the table. But I would say the government has supported Ukraine diplomatically, humanitarian, financially, and militarily throughout this war. I mean, that's the first statement that needs to be made clearly. Now, has the support been as big as one would have wished for a country of our size? Well, I think I was very critical, especially in the first 6 months. I do seem to sense some improvement in the last couple of months, and the key indicator suggests that Germany is moving up in the rankings on the various dimensions. But I mean, I think what we have to realize here, and that's perhaps sort of to end my statement here, what we have to realize is that this war is far from over, right? And this is a really, really nasty, very, very difficult war where you know, the outcome, even though Ukraine has now really made some significant strategic gains in the last couple of months. I mean, throughout the war, actually, we are still in a situation where it's actually not at all clear that Ukraine, you know, will be victorious. And you know, and I guess what we have to think about next year is sort of the theory of victory, right? I mean, sort of it sounds a bit abstract, but Russia, I think, has a theory of victory, which is basically bearing down Ukraine, and you know, at some stage overwhelming it, even though there's thousands of soldiers, Russian soldiers, just being destroyed and being annihilated as cannon fodder, right? But what's the theory of victory of the West, and how do we get there? And I think that's a strategic debate that is very much dominated, of course, by the US. It's Washington that calls the shots, and I think you know, Germany is mostly following at this stage. But I think we will be increasingly called upon to really sort of make a positive contribution also to final, I mean, to basically a theory of victory, right? I mean, so now it's support, but is the support sufficient for Ukraine to really win this war? I don't think we are there. And you know, at that stage, it's a very difficult debate. I mean, and I think here we need to become clearer, and that's perhaps also a role where also DGAP, we have to do a little bit more thinking about, you know, what's sort of the big end game here, and how do we get there, and what can Germany's role be. So I think that's something to think about over the Christmas break, and perhaps have a great paper with a few colleagues early next year.
And we will also have internal discussions and colloquiums on that already planned for January. But for the time, we are already running out of time. And let me maybe ask Caroline for your closing remarks, if you can keep it to 1 minute.
Difficult to predict anything for the new year. I agree with Guntram that it's probably going to be a long war. Trenches are being dug. We can't make any comparison to previous wars, but this happened in the First World War as well, and it lasted forever. So the past year has changed, I think, the European Union. That's where I sit in Brussels, has changed policy making in the EU, I think, forever. Things are going very fast. Europe is also it's more consolidated in a way. Somebody said Vladimir Putin deserves the Charlemagne Prize for uniting Europeans. It's a bit cynical, but there is something to it, of course. I think the big question will be how we're going to keep that up in the next year. And it's very difficult for Europeans to face the kind of destruction and chaos that Putin is sowing both in Ukraine but also in Europe, trying to divide us, trying to to confuse everybody. I think it will be a challenging year again. We've done a lot in the past year that nobody would have thought we would ever do. Discuss European defense, for instance, or jointly procure energy supplies. But the challenges will continue, and we every day is a new one. I'm not pessimistic, but it's going to be a challenging year again.
With this, let me thank you to all our speakers, Caroline de Gruyter, Guntram, Wolff, and András Rácz, for preparing for this morning and spending this morning with us. Thank you to all of you.
And we resume.
Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas. Happy New Year.
Merry Christmas, and we resume on the 12th of January.
Exactly right. So thank you, and see you in the next year.